Hello there. Good evening. Welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, you'll find us at jimbotalk.net. You can follow me on Twitter at Jimbo Talks. As we'll take a look tonight at the Trump bump. And certainly there has been a bump in a number of areas of activity, a Wall Street bump. But we're talking tonight about the Trump real estate bump, which I suppose would be rather appropriate, given that we have a president who made his mark and his fortune in the area of real estate. But we'll talk a bit about this, about what is happening and the extent to which Donald Trump could claim credit for it, with Tom Booker. He's managing director at the Collingwood Group. And good evening, Tom.
Good evening, Jim.
Good to have you on the program this evening. First of all, what's happening in housing? If you have not been out there looking to buy or sell, and I have not, I had not been really aware of this, but give us some data to let us know just where real estate has been in the first 100 days of this administration.
Well, real estate is a hot asset in the first 100 days of this administration. March prices are up over 4.4% from a year ago. The average price of a home across the United States in March was about $236,400, up 6.8% from March 2016, where it was $221,400. That's a pretty stiff increase. Inventories are extraordinarily tight. The discussion in the housing market is about, can I find a home to buy, and how do we get current homeowners to sell? Interest rates are low. The 10-year Treasury is at about 2.3%. This is about where it was almost a year ago. And so 30-year interest rates for those with good credit are at about 3.65%. So all in all, tight inventory, relatively high prices, very active market, and extraordinarily attractive interest rates. What's not to like?
Yeah, certainly if you're borrowing, very attractive. Now, of course, you often think of the Federal Reserve Board as having a greater impact than a president of the United States, but I guess to the extent that they had any impact on this, which would be in the area of interest rates, it would be a negative impact, albeit not much of one. But this Fed has chosen to hike interest rates a minuscule amount. Your take on the Fed and the Trump real estate bump?
Well, the Trump real estate bump, through the eyes of the Fed, is really one where I think America and many, after President Trump's election, were expecting an extraordinarily vigorous and vibrant first quarter. GDP came in a little lackluster, and to be fair, the first quarter GDP is usually a little lackluster because there's some hangover from the fourth quarter of the previous year, and there's some ambiguity about what the year is going to be about. So businesses typically begin to make their plans in January and don't do much of the execution until the second or third quarter. So to be fair, the first quarter is always a mix. What's important about the Fed is that the Fed was on a path to raise interest rates. And the idea was that this very robust economy was going to provide them with a rationale to be able to do so. However, given some of that ambiguity I just discussed, it doesn't appear that they're going to be able to do so. So at the end of the day, we're probably in an environment that looks a lot more like the environment we saw in 2016 than something very, very different and more aggressive in terms of interest rate hikes.
Just to talk a bit about interest rates for a moment, which is, of course, a factor, but not the only factor involved here. Interest rates, of course, are a double-edged sword. If you're borrowing, low rates are just dandy, and the recent history has been extremely fine. If you're living off of interest income, you've been dying out there. And also, the Fed has not had an awful lot of weapons available with which to, let's say, jumpstart the economy. It's awfully hard to cut interest rates when there are hardly any interest payments being made.
Yeah, it's very. We think the Fed is omnipotent and that they have tremendous control over the economy. However, when interest rates are high, they can do a lot to make them lower. When they're low, they can make them higher. Outside of that, they have some, for the average person, arcane devices to be able to control money supply and the flow of capital to institutions, but they don't really have a way to affect a lot of the action on the street. I think the important point here that you made, Jim, is that there has been 10 to 12 years where savers have not had the benefit of interest rates that would allow them to sustain themselves, and as a result, being able to get back to a period where interest rates look a lot more like the kind of rates that are required when you're taking normal business risk would be attractive to many parties, not only savers, but to a number of parties like banks who are trying to lend money against those.
All right, so what we're talking about here then would be a factor, but is this the dominant factor in this Trump bump? In other words, it's not a Fed bump, I gather.
You know, I think the dominant factor in the Trump bump is the fact that part of what you're expected to see is a more robust economy. The president has been outspoken and vigorous in his support of economic activity. There are many who not only believe him, but believe him in such a way that they're willing to take action against the promise of his success. And so the question is, when does it begin? And I for one think it's going to begin a little later than expected, but it's still going to occur. So at the end of the day, as long as the Fed doesn't do a whole lot to diminish the appeal of investing in America, which it doesn't look like they're going to do, the Trump bump has a great chance of happening.
So for that to happen to Wall Street, I think is easily understandable, even given his occasional threats to break up the big banks and things of that nature. It's easy to understand the Wall Street bump. Does real estate usually operate off of that kind of factor? I thought that real estate prices tended to go according to interest rates and according to, as you mentioned, housing inventory. That is to say, if you have a glut of houses out there, then it doesn't really matter how many people are looking to buy if there are so many houses that you're not going to eat into the glut. So I would have thought that other factors might have entered into this besides a general aura of optimism that Trump is going to put the economic blender on puree.
I like that term. Jim, you're right. I mean, the real estate markets are complex. First of all, they're tremendously local. Real estate's a very local business, so the circumstances that prevail in local geographies are the ones that are going to drive. So there are parts of the country that don't have short supply and actually probably don't have the income to be able to see the kind of growth in these numbers that I just laid out. I mean, it's pretty incredible when you see those numbers year over year growing 4% on a national average. That means there's some below and some higher. I think the second point that I would make is that in each one of these markets, affordability is an issue. So when you begin to look at where homes are versus where interest rates are, people have to make a decision about whether they are buying a home at the peak of the market. I mean, one of the relationships between real estate and interest rates, which you referred to, is that the whole idea is that the higher the interest rate, the lower the value of the real estate, and the lower the interest rate, the higher the value. So if you're buying a very fairly priced real estate asset at a very low interest rate, there is a concern that as interest rates rise, you may not see the benefit of greater increases over time. As a matter of fact, you may see either flat or falling rates at some point for some period of time. Mm-hmm. The last thing I'd add is that you made an incredible point about, the factors in real estate are really driven by incomes. And one of the things that is beginning to happen in the U.S. economy is we're beginning to see labor scarcity. And labor scarcity drives up income and wages. And the question is, how much will it do so? Because at some point, you're going to need to be able to have higher and higher wages to be able to fuel the demand for more expensive real estate, even if interest rates aren't rising. So those three factors, the local factors, the drivers around the expense of the home and where interest rates are going, and then frankly where incomes are, really do begin to make that puree, as you so appropriately stated.
Thank you. Going back to that first factor, I don't think we can overemphasize that. Whenever we talk about the housing market, that's a generalization that's really hard to make because not only is the housing market localized, but I have been told extremely localized, that even in the depths of the real estate bubble, there were places where homes could be purchased and for a pretty fair price. And that it is extremely local. Please go into that a bit more, if you would.
So there are parts of the country. I mean, the national numbers you heard me mention really do speak to kind of an average across the country. There are parts of the country, in some cases rural areas, and that's not rural areas everywhere. In some cases, parts of cities that are being gentrified. In other cases, there are geographies where, in effect, economic activity is diminishing, even in this more robust economy, and as a result, housing prices are not holding their value. I think the important point here is that not only is it a zip code or an area code or a state, but it really is the market in which you're looking for a home. So I'll give you an example. During this period, over the last 2 to 3 years, one of the areas that's really been making big gains has been affordable housing. And that's been the first-time buyer, home buyer. That's been the step-up home right after buying that first house. But the market that hasn't been moving very much has been the luxury home market. These are homes that are over $500,000, $700,000. Now, I understand that's not where everybody is, but I'm saying this to make a point. The point is, the markets that are beneath, the foundation for the luxury market is really move-up buyers. And if those markets are not very fluid, they're not very active, they aren't providing great opportunities for both new homeowners to get in and current homeowners to buy the step-up home, those luxury housing markets languish. Well, for the last 3 years, they really haven't moved a whole lot. Just recently, they began to come alive. You're now beginning to see the markets where more expensive homes are becoming more attractive because, frankly, more and more folks are getting involved in seeking home ownership. But that still is a local driver. So there are parts of California right now that aren't very attractive, parts of Nevada. There are parts of Texas that are very rural, that are very hot. So it really depends on where you are.
1-866-50-JIMBO, our number, 1-866-505-4626, and we'll come back and talk some more with our guest in this portion of the program who can give us a pretty fair reading on just where we are right now real estate-wise. He is the managing director of the Collingwood Group. Tom Booker, our guest, and we'll continue our discussion here after I take a look at something that you can do to save your company big money on business travel while getting a big surprise for you, a gift card. How about that? A gift card for every trip you buy. Now, at first, I thought that was a little bit much. Really? So I went to Upside.com, checked it out, and their searches are super fast, for one thing. Less than 2 minutes, and they gave me a few awesome choices. They offered United and American for flights to Chicago, which worked just fine for me, plus deals on some other big-name hotels that I could get. And I got this $200 gift card, which saved the company a lot of money. And now, if you're flexible about times and hotels, and most of us are a little flexible, the savings are even greater, and you get more in gift cards. Upside's the real deal. Got me a gift card for $200. So trust me, go to Upside.com today. Plus, when you use promo code JIMBO, you're guaranteed to get at least a $100 Amazon gift card your first trip. That's code JIMBO to get a $100 gift card free. Save big on travel and get a big gift card every trip. See what your next trip's worth today. Upside.com. That's Upside.com. Minimum purchase required. See site for complete details. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show, 1-866-50-JIMBO, our number, 1-866-505-4626. Are you thinking about homes, buying, selling, what have you? Tom Booker, our guest, is managing director with the Collingwood Group, and he's here to offer some thoughts about just where we stand right now in lieu of this, because of, I should say, this Trump bump that has occurred in real estate prices. All right, there is an air of optimism that Donald Trump will stimulate the economy. Now, it's a funny thing. Not all sectors of the economy are happy about stimulation. I've seen many a time that, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with a lower unemployment rate, and Wall Street will take that to mean there's going to be increased business activity, interest rates will go up, and the stock market will actually drop to that news. Counterintuitive to the rest of us, but I guess not to Wall Street investors. Now, to what extent do real estate sales march in lockstep with what is generally considered to be good economic news?
Well, Jim, real estate prices typically do march in lockstep with good economic news as long as the economic news doesn't get too frothy. And I guess the point I would make is in this environment, probably the three largest factors are local home prices, and that's the question of what homes cost. I'll give you an example. If you look at a house in the East, a house will cost you on average in the neighborhood of $224,000. A house in the Midwest, somewhere around $183,000. House in the South, $210,000, but the average in the West Coast is $347,000. So there's a real broad range across America for what housing costs. And the question is, if that moves too quickly, or if it moves too quickly, if it moves too fast, too far, that's a real challenge. Same thing with interest rates. Low interest rates are good, but even if you have low interest rates that move to just a little bit higher, but they move with a velocity, with a speed that's off-putting and creates a lack of confidence in borrowers, that's one of the things that can slow this down. The last thing is really income growth. And the one thing we want to see in our economy is even income growth. We'd like to see all sectors of the economy have income growth. Well, that doesn't usually happen. You have some that grow more, others that grow less, and some that decrease. And so the real challenge here is, the kind of the Goldilocks problem, not too warm, not too cold. And how do we, as consumers, get a sense for where we are in that mix?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, you talked about a surge, I believe, in low-income housing. I would always have assumed that as long as there is demand for it, that contractors would rather build higher income housing just because, again, an assumption on the part of this layman that you can build on a higher profit margin.
Jim, that's an accurate assessment. I think the thing that has been challenging cities like San Francisco and very other high-cost areas, Chicago, Miami, L.A., New York, Boston, I mean, we can pick a number of these areas, is that what you'd like to do is if you're a builder, you'd like to buy the land and build a property that everybody who can afford to live there would want to buy. The challenge is, in many geographies, if you're going to have people who do the work, people who make life work for these geographies, they need to have a place to live. And in many cases, you'd like to give them the kind of place that they could own. So there are a number of tax incentives. There's a number of inducements that political subdivisions provide to be able to provide some measure of affordable housing. And affordable has a loose definition, but housing that's less expensive, should I say, than what you might expect the market to bear. And frankly, in this environment where land is very expensive, taxes are high, interest rates are low, it's difficult. I mean, as a raw input, land is very expensive right now.
All right, fair enough. We've got more to come. 1-866-50-JIMBO, our number, 1-866-505-4626. And we're talking with Tom Booker, Managing Director at the Collingwood Group, and looking at the Trump bump in real estate. Back with more in just a moment. Glad you're with us on the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We're talking with Tom Booker from the Collingwood Group, Managing Director there, as we look at the Trump bump. I'm wondering the extent to which you think that this will continue. In other words, what could interrupt this?
Well, there are a number of things that could interrupt it. Probably the biggest thing is really hopefully we don't have a circumstance where the nation has a conflict that takes all of the nation's attention to concerns about security. That's number one thing. I'd say the second thing that could disrupt this is a market slowing in the economy. And right now, the greatest concern that's driving that concern is really around a tax cut. And then the last thing I'd say is that there was something to come apart in the job market where we didn't have the wage growth. There's two extraneous factors, security and how the nation functions. But the last one is job and income growth that really could be a driver. And right now we don't see those happening, but those could be real challenges moving forward.
Job growth and income growth don't always move in parallel. Sometimes, in fact, they are the opposite sides of the same coin. I note, for example, the impact of increasing the minimum wage. In many cases, you're talking about a few people who will get $15 an hour and a lot of others who will be simply dropped as automation replaces those jobs, or for other reasons, low-skilled jobs are simply deemed no longer worth $15 an hour. So how does real estate react to that? Let's say wages go up, but employment goes down, or the reverse.
Real estate's going to be really a supply and demand driven kind of feature in the local market in which it exists. So, Jim, it absolutely will not be immune to all of those factors. And by the way, it's going to have something to do with which employers are active in that area and which employers choose to leave, which employers choose to grow their workforce, which employers choose to stay pat or diminish their workforce. That's going to be a function of the local market. What is really important about what you just said is that the churning in our economy is creating a set of circumstances where a number of American circumstances are changing. And they're changing not just because of the way the economy operates and whether incomes are different, but literally what jobs are there, what they pay, and what happens to those folks trying to seek those jobs or trying to sustain those jobs. And that's a very key point in the real estate market. I'm glad you raised that point.
Looking at people who have some money to invest, would this be a good time to invest in rental properties?
Boy, you asked the loaded question. So there is, if you look at the commercial multifamily indices, they're at some of their highest levels that they've ever been at historically. And these are the indices that track the level of investment in large multifamily apartment buildings and condominiums and circumstances like that. So at one level, there's a high level of investment. So I'm gonna tell two sides of the story. The other set of indices you look at are the number of indexes that look at folks who are actually able to take single-family dwellings and either split them into 2-unit or 4 units, or maybe even rent the house as a single unit. And that's been a very robust market for the last 10 years. The one thing that is beginning to change is that as millennials get a little older, 2/3 of millennials are under the age of 30, and the average age of a new home buyer is 31 years old. So we're getting some folks who are starting to hit that threshold. What you've got to begin to question in this environment is if you bought a rental property, it's okay to buy the rental property with a conservative assumption about what you might perceive as a rent. But if you're going to assume that, one, you're going to have it rented all the time, and two, that you're going to see ever-increasing rates, that actually may happen, but that's going to be a function of some other factors other than demographics. And so what I'm saying here is this is a time to tread lightly and to do your homework, because more and more of the folks who normally buy homes are reaching an age and a circumstance and an income circumstance that are going to allow them to. And this could be a difficult time in certain markets for investing in real estate, in rental real estate. Let's
go away from hard economics down to plain old emotion, and we'll go back in my day, yeah. We'll go back a little bit, geezer alert here, that I grew up at the end of World War II. And we had just come out of the Great Depression and the greatest war in history, and all of a sudden prosperity was just dripping off of things. All those GIs were coming home, they were making babies, and by gosh, there were jobs for everybody. And that economic blender was on puree. And we wanted space. That is not something we'd always had necessarily. We wanted space. We wanted cars to go out and drive to our new suburban homes. And it was the sign of the new prosperity. I can recall my father taking us on a Sunday drive. This was virtually every Sunday. We didn't have any place to go, although we would usually find some place, but that wasn't the purpose. Getting there was not half the fun. It was all the fun because we had the freedom, and gasoline was, probably less than a quarter a gallon, this sort of thing. And we had the house, which I'm not even sure what my 2-bedroom home cost, but I'm guessing in the neighborhood of $4,000 or $5,000 probably. My father always regretted he didn't scrape together enough money to buy 2 or 3 of those and enter into the very circumstance that we talked about just a second ago. Today, we are told, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's probably less of a desire on the part of younger people to have cars, more of a willingness to trade space for proximity and the like. And I'm wondering the extent to which the old American dream of the single-family detached home with the white picket fence and the 2.5 children, how much of that is still alive? Because that clearly can drive whether or not we're willing to make an investment in something as expensive as a house.
Jim, you've hit at the third rail in the real estate market. So a lot of what you've said for a certain segment of the real estate buying public is accurate. The challenge is that for some others it may not be. So, for example, I'll pick on the millennial. The millennial is often thought about as this changeling, that they're doing something very different than their parents did. Well, when they get to be 31 years old, they look a lot like their parents. However, they don't buy like their parents did. There's a real sense of utility that real estate serves. The home, as you just said, when we get down to emotion, research tells us that for many millennials, a home purchase is an emotional purchase. It's a very utilitarian. It's about being able to resell. Their assumption is not that they're going to live there forever. Their assumption is that the home is going to be a smart move, a better circumstance, creature comfort for a period of time. So they do look to resale. They look to being able to resell with a profit. And so one of the things that does begin to play into that is proximity to work. Being located close to city centers provides 2 things. One, it gives you proximity to work now, but it also provides you with a ready market of buyers if you go to sell. So this whole question around liquidity and utilitarianism is a little different for millennials now. However, when they begin to have children and they begin to think about schooling and they begin to think about the things that they want out of life, they look a lot like generations before them. So sometimes they look very different and very savvy about the way they do things, and then sometimes they just look like the rest of us did 30 or 40 years ago.
Stay with us. More to come. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Are you in the real estate market, buying and or selling? And if so, do you see a Trump bump? We'll continue our discussion with Tom Booker, Managing Director at the Collingwood Group, in just a moment. Glad you're with us on the Jim Bohannon Show. Thanks for joining us. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626 with Tom Booker, our guest, Managing Director of the Collingwood Group. We, of course, heard so much about Donald Trump cutting regulations, the regulatory red tape. Most of us aren't aware of all the details, except maybe in our own business. I know that the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai, has all kinds of ideas on cross-ownership rules and similar stuff that aren't part of this conversation, and that should definitely stimulate broadcasting. Now then, what regulations have been in place, Tom Booker, that have held back home construction, and what is the president's policy, his stance on removing them?
Well, most home construction laws are local. Probably the biggest set of challenges for home builders really have more to do with the local standards on environmental protections, environmental studies. Probably the ones that really do begin to hit an area where President Trump can begin to have an impact is around lending rules. Community banks right now, because of the way Dodd-Frank works, have a limitation on the amount of real estate lending they can do. especially on raw land. And raw land is what developers need to be able to borrow against. Now, there are a lot of people that say that's what got us into the problem. Well, you're going to have to find a way to strike a balance if you're going to have more houses built. And right now we have anemic levels of new home construction. The other area that's important is that many of the laws that define the ability to repay and some of the things that define consumer attractiveness that limit product diversity, things that would allow people to get into homes, are really constrained by the way the regulations work. So there are a number of ways at the federal level that regulations have minimized the opportunity for homeowners to gain access to housing. And then locally, there's a lot of ways that lenders could help stimulate the development of new housing if there were less stringent requirements placed upon them for